Speaker.
Jan Logie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pleased to rise and take a short call. I don't think I'll feel compelled to take the full 10 minutes on the third reading of this bill, though I have listened with some interest to the history and the stories that have been told in the House tonight, and it is always nice when the House is in agreement on a bill, and the sense of working together to solve problems. It's a novelty and it's a pleasant one. So this bill, the Christian churches in New Zealand began in Nelson in 1844, so I'm adding my piece of history to everyone else's. And a church was opened the following year in Auckland, and my understanding is that the movement grew significantly through the 19th century until the point where we now have 44 progressive churches around the country. The minister sponsoring this bill has spoken positively of the role of the church in his community in Nelson, as we also heard from the Honourable Chester Burrows this evening as well, in his upbringing, and noting that they work with youth and families, providing very real and much needed support, as well as we've just heard now, opportunity for spiritual enlargement or enlightenment. The bill is a private bill that was introduced by last year by the Honourable Dr. Nick Smith. It enables the repeal of the Associated Churches of Christ Church Property Act of 1929, enabling the dissolution of the Associated Churches of Christ Church Extension and Property Trust Board, which means they will be able to transfer all the property powers and legal obligations of that trust board to a new charitable trust, which is now called the Christian Churches New Zealand Property Trust Board. This bill gives that trust the legal power to do that, and it will also deliver more modern governance structure and give them more flexibility in how they use their resources and deliver on their mission. I think it is important to acknowledge that the Christian Churches New Zealand asked Parliament from a decision at its conference in 2013 to introduce this legislation and make these changes to enable it to be more flexible on the use of its property or the proceeds from the sale of that property. Because the existing Act on our statute books from 1929 gives an impression that the trust is restricted to the use of the money or proceeds from the sale of property only towards other property. And the churches want to be able to use it for other charitable Christian purposes. The churches have met every year since 1905 in this country and continue to have annual conferences. And it was at that conference that the churches and the owners of these properties thoroughly debated and supported the changes that are now have been through the Select Committee process and are in front of the House. I personally don't really understand the historical context that required legislation to govern church activity. I always thought that, rather baldly, I guess, that there was a separation between church and state and that the business of a church had no place in this House. But that was how things were done back then, that there was legislation governing a whole range of organisations, including some of our churches. So that requires this Parliament to introduce legislation to repeal those acts or to amend them, which is what we are doing here. In my view, it's not our job to make comment on the wishes of the church. Our job is purely to consider the quality of the legislation and how it might interact with other legislation or in practice, not to make comment on the intent or the delivery of a church role. that is their business, and it's not appropriate, in my view, for us to be commenting on that. Through the select committee process, there were, as has been mentioned, only 2 submissions, and there was not a huge amount of detailed discussion through or dispute through the select committee process. I guess the most gnarly issue was about whether there should be a sunset clause to this bill to take the Act off the statute books altogether, and the decision was not to do that because there may well be people who have left provisions in their will to leave money or property indeed to the church, as it was known previously in the legislation. And if a sunset clause was introduced, that may mean that money or property ended up in trust and not going towards the church. So that would defeat the purpose, and again would not be something that Parliament or the church would have intended. So the bill is as it is without that sunset clause, and the Green Party is very happy to support it because it reflects the intention of the churches and their desire to move forward. Thank you.